sunrise over the sprawling acreage of Ethan Carter's ranch cast a gentle glow over a property he cherished above all else, a sanctuary he'd earned after years of service and sacrifice. A decorated military veteran turned dedicated city official, Ethan now found his daily battles not on foreign soil, but right here on his land. This was a place where every weathered board and every well-worn path told the story of hard-won freedom and the promise of a peaceful life. Each morning, as he sipped his strong black coffee on the creaking wooden steps of his porch, he allowed his mind to drift between the discipline of his past and the simple joys of the present. Restoring classic cars in his modest garage was more than a hobby. It was a tribute to the art of resilience and the beauty of craftsmanship, a beauty reflected in every detail of his beloved ranch. The ranch wasn't merely a cluster of buildings and fenced-off fields. It was a living memory. Every element, from the carefully mended fence that bordered his property to the ancient oak standing guard at its edge, embodied years of labor, love, and legacy. That very fence, lovingly maintained over countless seasons, symbolized Ethan's independence. It wasn't just a barrier against intruders. It was a statement of personal integrity, a tangible reminder of the values he fought so hard to uphold. But not everyone in the community saw the fence as a cherished relic. In the eyes of Kerren, the self-appointed enforcer of suburban perfection, and the HOA's formidable president, the fence was an unacceptable aberration. With her meticulously coiffed hair, clipboard always in hand, and an unwavering air of entitlement, Kerren ruled over the homeowners association with an iron fist and a penchant for trivial details. In her eyes, every homeowner's personal expression had to bend to a rigid standard of aesthetics and conformity. And now, her sights had fallen on Ethan's prized fence. It was on a brisk autumn morning when the brewing conflict first came into sharp focus. Ethan had just stepped outside to load his tools for a routine repair on one of the vintage vehicles, when a flurry of voices and the unmistakable click of heels on gravel reached his ears. He looked up to see Kerren striding purposefully along the edge of his property, her gaze fixed intently on the fence that had witnessed decades of storms and celebrations alike. "Ethan, I need to speak with you," she announced, her tone a curious blend of false concern and imperious command. Her eyes, cold and appraising, swept over the weathered boards and intricate detailing of the fence, a structure that, in her view, was a blemish on the neighborhood's pristine image. Ethan's calm demeanor belied the storm of memories and emotions swirling beneath the surface. He had seen many such mornings, where Kerren's sudden appearances heralded a new round of petty accusations. "Good morning, Kerren," he replied in a measured tone that carried the weight of his experiences. "What seems to be the matter today?" Without preamble, Kerren launched into her well-rehearsed tirade. "Your fence is not in compliance with the community standards," she declared, her voice clipped and unyielding. "It disrupts the visual harmony of our neighborhood. It must be modified immediately to meet the guidelines." Her words, intended as an unassailable decree, echoed off the tidy hedges and manicured lawns that surrounded them. For Ethan, whose life had been built on principles of duty and honor, these words stung all the more. The fence was more than a boundary. It was a repository of memories, a living emblem of his struggle for independence. "Kerren," he replied, his voice steady but laced with quiet defiance, "this fence has stood for years as a part of my heritage. I see no violation here. It's been maintained according to local regulations, and it stands as a testament to my commitment to this property and the values I hold dear." Kerren's face tightened into a thin-lipped scowl. In her mind, the rules were sacrosanct, rules designed to impose order on what she saw as a chaotic medley of individual tastes. "Rules are not suggestions, Ethan," she snapped. "They're mandates that protect our community's integrity. If you refuse to correct this, I will have no choice but to escalate the matter to the board." Her tone brooked no debate. As her words faded into the quiet morning, a hush fell over the scene. Neighbors began to peek from behind curtains and over garden fences, drawn by the tension of the confrontation. The old oak tree rustled, as if whispering secrets of past disputes and unheeded warnings. In that charged moment, Ethan realized that what began as a seemingly minor challenge was about to morph into a full-blown clash, a battle for the very soul of his home, and a stand against the creeping authoritarianism of an HOA that cared little for the personal stories behind every board and fence post. The stage was set. On one side stood a man defined by honor, forged in the fires of conflict and tempered by service, whose only rebellion was the quiet assertion of his right to a legacy built with sweat and perseverance. On the other, a woman whose fervor for conformity and her own sense of entitlement blinded her to the very essence of community spirit. In that early morning light, as the promise of another day stretched before them, Ethan Carter silently vowed that he would defend his home and his fence against any intrusion, however petty it might seem. Little did he know, this confrontation was the spark that would ignite a wildfire of resistance and ultimately reshape the community's future. The following morning dawned with an unsettling chill, as though the crisp air itself carried whispers of impending conflict. Ethan awoke to a sense of quiet determination, expecting a day of routine maintenance on his beloved ranch. Instead, as he stepped outside, he was met with an unexpected and infuriating sight, a large, official-looking envelope, sealed and stamped with the HOA's insignia, affixed to his front door. Inside the envelope lay a notice that made Ethan's heart sink. The document outlined a staggering fine of $750 for violating community light regulations, a charge that made little sense, given that his home had long been in full compliance with local standards. The words on the paper seemed designed to shock and intimidate, a bureaucratic maneuver intended to silence any opposition. Ethan's experienced eyes scanned the document, noting the legal jargon and threatening tone. This was no minor oversight. It was a calculated move by the HOA to establish dominance. Before he could fully process the situation, the sound of deliberate footsteps and the rustling of fabric announced the arrival of Kerren. Standing on the edge of his property with her arms confidently crossed, she exuded an air of smug entitlement. Her eyes sparkled with a sense of self-righteous authority as she addressed him. "Good morning, Ethan," Kerren said in a tone that mixed faux concern with an unmistakable expectation of immediate compliance. "It appears you've disregarded the community standards once again." Ethan's brow furrowed as he regarded her calmly. "Kerren, I received your notice," he said steadily, his voice betraying neither anger nor fear. "However, I must remind you that I've always maintained my property according to both local regulations and our community's guidelines. This fine seems arbitrary." Unfazed, Kerren replied with a dismissive wave of her hand. "The rules are the rules, Ethan. They are in place for the benefit of everyone in our neighborhood. Your refusal to adhere will only result in further penalties." Her words were accompanied by a condescending smile that failed to hide the underlying threat. Refusing to be intimidated, Ethan took a measured step forward. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," he explained. "I've reviewed the local ordinances, and my property clearly falls within the legal standards. If you feel otherwise, I'm more than willing to discuss it with the appropriate authorities." His tone was calm, yet carried an edge of determination, a silent declaration that he would not be bullied. Kerren's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a steely glint of determination of her own. "If you insist on challenging our standards, then prepare to face the consequences," she said, her voice growing colder. "I've already informed the board about your noncompliance, and they expect strict adherence to our regulations. It won't be long before additional fines and legal actions follow." True to her word, within hours a series of unsettling events began to unfold. As Ethan returned to his daily tasks, a flurry of activity erupted around his property. Neighbors reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles parked near his home, marked with the insignia of local inspectors. Before long, a team of officials arrived, their clipboards in hand and their expressions grave. They began meticulously surveying his property, scrutinizing every detail from the placement of his outdoor lights to the very structure of his cherished fence. Ethan, well versed in local laws and his rights as a homeowner and city official, calmly engaged with the inspectors. "I appreciate your diligence," he said, handing over copies of the necessary permits and legal documents, "but as you can see, everything is in order." His tone was respectful yet assertive, a quiet assertion of his authority in the face of bureaucratic overreach. Despite his efforts to clarify the situation, Kerren continued her campaign of intimidation. She circulated additional notices among the neighbors, each one laced with warnings and legal threats. Rumors began to swirl that Ethan's property was subject to numerous hidden violations, an allegation that was entirely baseless but served to undermine his reputation within the community. At a local zoning office, Ethan's formal complaint about the fine and the unwarranted inspection was met with a cautious response. The officials promised to review the case, yet days turned into weeks without any clear resolution. Meanwhile, more anonymous complaints began to flood in regarding his property. It became evident that Kerren was orchestrating a systematic effort to tarnish his standing and force his capitulation through sheer intimidation. As the pressure mounted, Ethan's resolve only hardened. In private conversations with a few trusted neighbors, he detailed the irregularities he had noticed in the HOA's practices, procedures that seemed designed to favor Kerren's personal vendettas rather than genuine community welfare. His words resonated with those who, like him, had quietly suffered under the weight of arbitrary rules and overzealous fines. Yet even as he built a case against the seemingly invincible HOA, Ethan could not shake the feeling that the board was being manipulated by Kerren's unchecked ambition. Her blatant disregard for fairness was not just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of abuse. With each passing moment, it became increasingly clear that the fine and the ensuing inspection were just the beginning of a much larger power play. Kerren's initial fine, intended to be a clear message, had inadvertently united the community against her. But as Ethan stood his ground, armed with both legal knowledge and the unwavering support of those who believed in fairness, it was clear that this conflict was evolving into a battle for the very soul of the neighborhood. And for Ethan, it was a fight he was determined to see through, no matter the cost. In the days following the unsettling inspection, Ethan began to notice that Kerren's tactics were growing increasingly audacious and entirely unlawful. A new letter arrived one morning, its tone more threatening than the last. This time, it wasn't merely a fine. It was a formal notice, hinting at eviction, and even the possibility of property seizure. The letter alleged that Ethan's persistent noncompliance with the community's arbitrary standards gave the HOA the right to take drastic measures against him. The message was clear: bend to Kerren's demands or face the legal consequences. Ethan's experienced mind, sharpened by years of service and public duty, recognized immediately that something was deeply amiss. Eviction from one's own property was not only a violation of basic homeowner rights, it was an outright abuse of power. Determined to understand the full scope of the HOA's overreach, Ethan began a meticulous investigation into the association's inner workings. He started by combing through meeting minutes, financial records, and correspondence that hinted at irregularities within the board. It wasn't long before he uncovered a troubling pattern. Numerous homeowners had quietly grumbled about unfair practices, but none had dared to speak out, until now. Late one evening, while poring over documents in the solitude of his study, Ethan received a discreet tip from an anonymous board member. The tipster revealed that Kerren had been channeling HOA funds into her personal ventures, using the guise of enforcing community standards to justify hefty fines that padded her own bank account. The revelation sent a shiver down his spine. Not only was the HOA's operation tainted by corruption, but Kerren was also using the power of her position to further her own financial interests at the expense of her neighbors. Armed with this damning information, Ethan knew that he needed undeniable proof before he could take his fight to a broader stage. He installed discreet cameras around the property, not just to document the ongoing harassment, but to capture any illicit activities that might be taking place under the HOA's watch. His days became a balancing act of routine ranch work and covert surveillance, each moment laced with the tension of what might be revealed on camera. Meanwhile, Kerren's tactics grew bolder. She began issuing false violation notices to other homeowners, fabricating reasons ranging from unauthorized landscaping to improper storage of recreational equipment. Her actions stirred unease throughout the community, with more residents beginning to question the legitimacy of her authority. Some board members, previously silent in their support, started to murmur about the growing inconsistency in the rules and the disproportionate fines that seemed to target only the most vocal dissenters. These internal cracks were subtle at first, a sideways glance during meetings, a hushed conversation in the corridors, but they signaled the beginning of a shift in sentiment. At a tense board meeting held in a cramped community hall, Ethan was invited to speak after several members expressed concerns over the recent spate of extreme measures. The room was heavy with anticipation as he laid out the documented evidence of the false violations and pointed to the irregularities in the HOA's financial dealings. "We are not a community that thrives on intimidation," Ethan stated firmly, his voice echoing off the walls. "These actions are a direct violation of our rights as homeowners and a clear abuse of power." His words resonated with many who had long felt oppressed by the arbitrary enforcement of outdated rules. Yet, even as a few board members tentatively questioned Kerren's methods, she maintained a facade of authority. In a curt response during the meeting, she dismissed Ethan's allegations as mere exaggerations by a disgruntled homeowner. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Over the next few days, whispers circulated among the community. Rumors of misappropriated funds, secret meetings held without proper notice, and complaints that had mysteriously vanished from official records. Determined to turn the tide, Ethan began a more aggressive campaign of gathering evidence. He collected copies of every violation notice issued, cross-referenced them with community guidelines, and compiled a detailed timeline of the suspicious activities. His investigation extended to speaking privately with neighbors, many of whom admitted that they had been coerced into silence by the HOA's veiled threats and relentless fines. Every conversation further bolstered his resolve. It became increasingly clear that Kerren's vendetta was not just a personal quirk, but part of a broader pattern of corruption and exploitation. As Ethan pieced together the puzzle, the community started to rally behind him. A sense of unity began to emerge, a shared understanding that their voices, once suppressed by Kerren's authoritarian rule, could now be a force for change. And while Kerren's tactics had grown more desperate and legally dubious, they were also beginning to expose her true character to everyone. Her attempts to intimidate had backfired, as the evidence of her misdeeds and the blatant threats of a legal eviction painted a stark picture of her misuse of power. In that critical moment, as the truth began to surface, Ethan knew that his next steps would determine the future of the neighborhood. The battle lines were drawn, not just between one man and an entitled enforcer, but between the fundamental rights of homeowners and an overbearing institution. The stage was set for a decisive counterattack, one that would expose the corruption at the heart of the HOA and ultimately restore fairness and dignity to the community. It all came to a head one frosty morning when Ethan woke to an ominous silence that enveloped the ranch. The power had been abruptly shut off, plunging the once comforting hum of daily life into a deafening void. In the quiet, Ethan discovered a note taped to his door, a curt, officious missive from the HOA declaring that his utilities were to be suspended for unauthorized modifications made to his property. In truth, the note was nothing more than a thinly veiled attempt by Kerren to assert control and intimidate him into submission. Ethan's mind raced as he pieced together the sequence of events. Just last week, Kerren had been dismissive yet firm in her threats, but now her tactics had escalated to the point of interfering with his daily life. Shifting into action, he retrieved his phone and immediately contacted his trusted electrician, who confirmed that the shutdown was not due to any technical error. It was a deliberate move by the HOA's hired contractor. This blatant overreach was the last straw. Refusing to allow his livelihood to be held hostage by an unaccountable regime, Ethan set out to reclaim his autonomy. His first move was to secure legal counsel, gathering all necessary documents that showed his property complied with both local and community standards. Armed with this paperwork, he promptly reached out to the local utility company and demanded an explanation. Within hours, the power was restored, a small victory that only fueled his determination. But Kerren wasn't about to let up. Later that same day, As Ethan began to resume normal activities, he heard the shrill sound of sirens and the roar of engines. A tow truck, emblazoned with the HOA's logo, was seen slowly maneuvering toward his property. The target, his beloved fence. According to a hastily prepared letter pinned to the truck, the fence was deemed hazardous and in violation of zoning codes, a claim that was as ludicrous as it was unfounded. Ethan's neighbors, already agitated by the recent shutdown, gathered around to witness this blatant act of overreach. Standing resolute, he confronted the tow truck driver. "This fence is a cherished part of my heritage and is fully compliant with every regulation," he stated, his voice steady yet laced with defiance. The driver, caught between his orders and the respect commanded by Ethan's unwavering presence, hesitated. That moment of pause was all Ethan needed. He quickly recorded the entire encounter on his phone, ensuring that every moment of this injustice would be documented. News of these extreme measures spread like wildfire through the community. At the evening HOA meeting, which was already teetering on the edge of dissent, Ethan stepped forward, file in hand, to confront the board. With a calm authority born of years in public service, he laid out the evidence of Kerren's latest actions: the illegal utility shutdown, the fraudulent zoning notice, and the attempted towing of his fence. He detailed each incident meticulously, making clear that these were not isolated missteps, but part of a broader, systematic abuse of power. "Today we stand at a crossroads," Ethan declared, his voice resonating across the room. "Either we continue to allow this tyranny to rule our community, or we stand together to uphold our rights as homeowners." His words were met with a mix of murmurs and nods. For too long, many residents had suffered in silence, fearful of provoking Kerren's wrath. But now, faced with the undeniable evidence of her overreach, the tide was turning. Some board members, their resolve shaken by the mounting evidence and the palpable anger in the room, began questioning the legitimacy of Kerren's authority. A few even admitted that the strict rules and draconian fines seemed less about maintaining community standards and more about consolidating power. Yet Kerren, perched at the head of the table, maintained a rigid facade. With a cool, measured tone, she dismissed the accusations as overreactions and misinterpretations of her role. Her inability to counter the facts only further eroded her support. As Ethan concluded his presentation, a palpable shift occurred among the community members. Neighbors who had once hesitated to voice their concerns now rallied behind him, their collective disapproval of the HOA's actions now too strong to ignore. In hushed conversations after the meeting, residents expressed their gratitude for Ethan's courage and vowed to stand together against any future injustices. But even as Kerren's carefully constructed world began to crumble, she refused to admit defeat. In a final act of desperation before leaving the meeting, she threatened that legal action would be taken against anyone who challenged the HOA's decisions, an empty promise that only served to underline her isolation. The community, emboldened by Ethan's clear demonstration of their rights, knew that they had seen the turning point. For Ethan, the day's battles had not only reclaimed his property, but had also ignited a spark of unity among his neighbors. The extreme measures employed by Kerren had inadvertently united a fragmented community. As he looked around at the faces of those who had come to his side, Ethan felt a quiet satisfaction. The HOA's tyranny had been exposed, and while Kerren's resolve remained unbroken, the once powerful figure was now standing on the precipice of public accountability. In that charged moment, as the community embraced the promise of justice, Ethan realized that this was just the beginning. The real fight was yet to come, a fight for transparency, fairness, and the right to live free from the oppressive dictates of an entitled few. The tension in the community had reached a fever pitch, and Kerren, cornered by mounting evidence and a united neighborhood, was not ready to concede defeat. One early evening, with the setting sun casting long shadows over the manicured lawns, Kerren made her final, desperate bid to regain control. In a move that shocked even the most hardened residents, she dialed the local police station, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation as she reported a supposed public disturbance emanating from Ethan's property. According to Kerren's frantic account, Ethan's outdoor lighting, which he had long maintained as a symbol of pride and heritage, was allegedly blinding passers-by and disrupting the peace. Within minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled up outside Ethan's home. As the officers approached, Kerren stood rigidly at the doorway, her eyes wide and hopeful that her dramatic appeal to authority would finally silence Ethan's defiance. Ethan, who had long anticipated such tactics, greeted the officers calmly as he stepped outside. With a measured tone, he explained that the lights were in full compliance with local ordinances, an assertion backed up by his meticulously kept records. Reaching into his pocket, he casually flashed his city official badge, a symbol of the trust and authority granted to him by the community he served. The officers exchanged skeptical glances before acknowledging that there was no basis for a disturbance call, much to Kerren's mounting frustration. The situation, intended to turn the tide in her favor, had instead only underscored the absurdity of her claims. Not one to accept defeat easily, Kerren's next move was even more audacious. Later that night, under the cloak of darkness, she covertly arranged for a private investigator, someone she believed could unearth damning dirt on Ethan. Dressed in a nondescript hoodie and armed with a set of tools that clattered softly in the quiet of the night, the PI approached Ethan's property. His target was not the well-maintained front yard or the charming porch lights, but rather Ethan's secure garage, rumored to hold files and documents that could be manipulated to tarnish his impeccable reputation. Unbeknownst to Kerren and her accomplice, Ethan had grown wary of further intrusions. In response to the escalating harassment, he had installed state-of-the-art security cameras around his property, a silent guardian recording every moment. As the PI fumbled with a lock on the side door of the garage, the red glow of a camera's indicator lit up the dark. The intruder's movements, awkward and hurried, were captured in high resolution, a digital testament to the lengths Kerren was willing to go. The next morning, the community meeting was abuzz with whispers and anticipation. Ethan, holding a USB drive loaded with incriminating video evidence, stepped up to the podium at the scheduled HOA gathering. The room, filled with residents who had long felt oppressed by Kerren's draconian measures, fell silent as Ethan connected his laptop to a projector. With calm authority, he introduced the footage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what you are about to see is not the work of a concerned citizen, but rather a deliberate act of trespass orchestrated by someone we once trusted to enforce our community standards." The video played out on the screen, a shadowy figure clearly identifiable as the hired private investigator, creeping along the perimeter of Ethan's garage. His furtive glances over his shoulder and the nervous twitch in his hand betrayed his true intent: to steal information that could be twisted into a weapon against an honest homeowner. Gasps and murmurs swept through the room. Neighbors exchanged incredulous looks as the undeniable evidence was laid bare for all to see. Kerren's eyes darted nervously around the room, realizing that her last-ditch effort had not only failed, but had now been broadcast to the very people she sought to intimidate. In a strained voice, she attempted to downplay the video. "This is a misunderstanding," she stammered, her usual commanding tone reduced to a fragile whisper. "It's all been blown out of proportion." But the damage was done. The community, already emboldened by Ethan's steadfast defense of their rights, now saw Kerren for what she truly was: a desperate, vindictive enforcer of arbitrary rules, willing to cross legal and ethical boundaries to serve her own interests. Several board members, their earlier doubts now transformed into firm resolve, voiced their outrage. The murmurs grew louder, transforming into outright condemnation of Kerren's actions. In that charged atmosphere, as neighbors rallied around Ethan's courageous stand, Kerren's power crumbled further. Her final desperate move had backfired spectacularly, sealing her fate in the eyes of the community. No longer could she hide behind the guise of authority or claim to be the protector of neighborhood standards. The evidence was irrefutable, and her attempts to manipulate the system had only exposed her true character. Ethan's steady, measured response and the community's overwhelming support marked a turning point. With Kerren's actions now public, the community was ready to demand accountability. As the meeting concluded, it was clear that the era of arbitrary fines, intimidation, and secretive power plays was coming to an end. Kerren's days as the enforcer of an unjust regime were numbered, and the neighborhood could finally look forward to a future where fairness and transparency reigned supreme. As word of Kerren's misdeeds spread like wildfire, the community found itself at a crossroads, a defining moment where collective frustration transformed into an unstoppable force for justice. It began with an emergency meeting convened by several brave board members who had grown disillusioned by the rampant abuses of power. In a packed community hall, where tension was palpable and every whispered conversation carried the weight of long-held grievances, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Residents, who once lived in fear of Kerren's capricious enforcement, now spoke with a determined clarity. They demanded accountability, transparency, and an end to the tyranny that had marred their once harmonious neighborhood. At the heart of the meeting stood a coalition of concerned homeowners and a handful of sympathetic board members, whose courage helped tip the scales. Documents, meticulously compiled by Ethan and other community advocates, detailed every overreach, from the bogus fines and illegal inspections to the shameful attempt at trespassing caught on camera. The incontrovertible evidence left little room for debate. With voices raised in unison, they denounced the arbitrary rules that had long been weaponized to serve personal vendettas, rather than community welfare. In a dramatic turn of events, the board, previously mired in silence under Kerren's domineering influence, finally took decisive action. In a vote that resonated as a collective roar for justice, Kerren was unceremoniously removed from her position as HOA president. The motion, passed overwhelmingly, symbolized not only a repudiation of her tyrannical methods, but also the reclamation of power by a community that had long been stifled by fear. With Kerren's exit, the HOA's authority began to crumble. An independent investigation was launched into the association's finances and decision-making processes, uncovering further evidence of misappropriated funds and opaque dealings. The scandal extended far beyond one individual's malfeasance. It exposed systemic issues that had allowed corruption to flourish unchecked. For Kerren, the downfall was both swift and public. No longer shielded by a compliant board or a fearful community, she was forced into a corner. Rumors of her financial improprieties and misuse of HOA funds spread even further, undermining any remaining support among the residents. Public humiliation soon followed. In local newspapers and social media posts, her name was linked not to community stewardship, but to scandal and abuse of power. The irony was not lost on the neighborhood. The very person who had once prided herself on upholding community standards was now seen as a cautionary tale, a warning against the dangers of unchecked entitlement and corruption. As the legal and financial ramifications mounted, the HOA's collapse became inevitable. City officials, alerted by the outcry and the wealth of documented evidence, imposed substantial fines on the association. The investigation led to reforms within the HOA, with new leadership committed to restoring transparency, fairness, and accountability. Ethan, whose steadfast resolve had become a beacon of hope, worked closely with the new board. Together, they established committees to ensure that homeowners had a voice and that all decisions were made openly, free from the shadow of past abuses. The once oppressive atmosphere that had long hung over the community was gradually replaced by a sense of liberation and renewal. Neighbors, emboldened by the dramatic change, began to reconnect, not as subjects under an authoritarian regime, but as active participants in shaping their collective future. Public gatherings turned from secretive whispers into celebratory assemblies, where plans for community improvement were laid out with optimism and resolve. For Ethan, the victory was bittersweet. While the crumbling of the old guard and the removal of Kerren marked a monumental triumph for justice, it also served as a reminder of the resilience required to stand against tyranny. With every step taken toward reform, he carried the memory of those long, arduous battles that had been fought not just for personal vindication, but for the restoration of dignity and fairness to the entire community. In the final days of Kerren's influence, as the remnants of her authority disintegrated before public eyes, she was left with little more than the bitter taste of defeat. Her once formidable presence had been reduced to a cautionary footnote in the history of the neighborhood, a stark reminder that no amount of entitlement or coercion could ultimately silence the collective voice of a united community. The HOA, now reborn under principles of integrity and accountability, stood as a testament to the power of unity and the enduring belief that every homeowner deserved respect and fairness. In the aftermath of the community's uprising and Kerren's public humiliation, the full force of the law descended on the HOA. What began as isolated grievances quickly unfolded into a comprehensive investigation by city officials, who had been alerted by the overwhelming evidence gathered by Ethan and other resolute homeowners. The investigation revealed a long list of illegal practices, from unauthorized fines and property seizures to the deliberate misappropriation of HOA funds. It was clear that the association had been operating well outside its legal mandate. The city wasted no time. A substantial fine was imposed on the HOA, sending a clear message that no organization was above the law. The court's ruling not only penalized the association financially, but also mandated a complete overhaul of its operations. In a series of dramatic hearings, local media captured every moment as residents and officials alike watched the once mighty board being held accountable. Several board members, who had either turned a blind eye or actively participated in the misdeeds, found themselves facing charges ranging from fraud to misconduct. The legal consequences underscored that corruption, once exposed, would not be tolerated. At one pivotal court session, Ethan took the stand as a spokesperson for the community. With a meticulously organized dossier of evidence in hand, photographs, recorded conversations, and detailed documents, he recounted the systematic abuses inflicted upon the neighborhood. His testimony painted a vivid picture of an association that had prioritized personal vendettas and profit over the well-being of its residents. The judge, moved by the clarity and gravity of the evidence, declared that the HOA's actions constituted a severe breach of trust and legal overreach. The ruling was unambiguous. The association would be fined heavily, and sweeping reforms were to be implemented to ensure transparency and accountability in the future. The courtroom victory sent shockwaves through the community. Inspired by the ruling, residents organized public forums where they discussed plans to rebuild their neighborhood on a foundation of trust and fairness. There was a palpable sense of liberation as homeowners, once intimidated into silence, found their voices united. The legal verdict did more than just punish the HOA. It galvanized the community into demanding that such abuses never be repeated. Ethan, ever the steadfast leader, used this opportunity to execute one final power move. He spearheaded an initiative to reclaim and repurpose the funds that had been misappropriated by the old board. Through transparent audits and open community meetings, the recovered resources were channeled into projects that directly benefited every homeowner. These projects ranged from enhancing local amenities to promoting community art and neighborhood beautification. This redirection of funds was not only a practical remedy, but also a symbolic reclaiming of power, a definitive stand that the community's resources should serve the public good, not individual greed. The court's decision and subsequent reforms marked a watershed moment for the neighborhood. Public records, once shrouded in secrecy, were now available for scrutiny, revealing the full extent of the corruption. The case became a landmark reminder that unchecked authority could and would be dismantled when citizens banded together in pursuit of justice. For Ethan, this final chapter in the legal battle was a resounding affirmation. Integrity and perseverance could overcome even the most entrenched systems of abuse. In the end, the legal consequences faced by the HOA were more than a punitive measure. They were a triumph for transparency, accountability, and the enduring power of a community united against tyranny. As the legal battles and public outrage culminated in the HOA's comprehensive reform, Kerren found herself isolated, stripped not only of her authority, but of her once untouchable reputation. The public humiliation she endured in the courtroom and at community meetings seeped into every facet of her personal life, leaving her scrambling for a semblance of control that was rapidly slipping away. Kerren's downfall began with the financial repercussions of her misdeeds. Rumors of her personal spending habits and the misuse of HOA funds quickly spread, and soon creditors began to circle. Her car, once a gleaming symbol of her self-importance, was repossessed amid mounting debts. The loss was not just a financial blow, it was a stark, public reminder that no one was above accountability. Neighbors who had once bowed to her diktats now exchanged knowing glances. Their support for her long evaporated. At home, the turbulence took on a more personal note. Kerren's marriage, which had always been under strain from her uncompromising ambition, began to unravel under the weight of public disgrace. Her husband, disillusioned by the relentless pursuit of power at the expense of family stability, filed for divorce, leaving her to confront the bitter reality of a life built on isolation and the fear of failure. In quiet moments, as she sat alone in a house that suddenly felt too vast and empty, Kerren could no longer deny the cost of her relentless pursuit of control. Her reputation continued to crumble in every public forum. Once a regular fixture at city events and local gatherings, Kerren was now seen arguing at City Hall, desperately attempting to avoid further fines and legal entanglements. Her outbursts, laced with both anger and regret, drew curious onlookers and sympathetic whispers in the corridors of power. It was as if the very institutions she had once manipulated were now turning against her, ensuring that her actions would not be forgotten. In an ironic twist of fate, the woman who had once imposed strict rules on her neighbors found herself at the mercy of the same bureaucratic system she had exploited. Word spread quickly when a local property management company, having taken notice of her notorious reputation, offered her a position as an assistant property manager for another HOA. The offer, though a lifeline of sorts, was a bitter pill to swallow, a stark reminder that her talents were now deemed suitable only for roles that enforced the very rules she had broken. The news sparked quiet amusement among some residents. Ethan even caught a glimpse of Kerren on her first day at the new job. Standing at a distance, he couldn't help but mutter with a wry smile, "I hope you like following the rules." The community's shift was palpable. Neighbors, who had once cowered under the weight of her authority, now greeted her with a mix of pity and derision. The fall from grace was complete, and the lessons of accountability and humility resonated deeply. Kerren's personal and professional life had collapsed into a cautionary tale, a vivid reminder of how quickly power can turn to isolation when wielded without fairness or empathy. For Ethan, witnessing Kerren's personal downfall was a moment of quiet vindication. Yet, it wasn't gloating that filled him, but rather a solemn satisfaction that justice, albeit delayed, had been served. The poetic justice of it all lay not in the spectacle of her humiliation, but in the restoration of balance within the community. As the neighborhood began to rebuild itself on the foundation of transparency and mutual respect, Kerren's legacy was sealed as a warning. Unchecked entitlement and abuse of power would always eventually face the light of day. In the weeks that followed the dramatic fall of the old HOA regime, the neighborhood began a slow but steady transformation. Gone were the days of whispered fears and furtive glances. Now, residents gathered openly, united by a shared commitment to transparency, fairness, and the joy of simply living without undue interference. Community events sprang up, from monthly block parties to collaborative garden projects, each a testament to the newfound spirit of togetherness that had emerged from the ashes of past tyranny. Ethan found himself at the center of this rejuvenated community, not as a rebel or a figure of conflict, but as a humble leader who had guided them toward a brighter, more inclusive future. Sitting on his once troubled porch, which now shone in the gentle glow of an evening sun, he watched neighbors laugh and converse freely. The sense of liberation was palpable, a living, breathing counterpoint to the dark days of arbitrary fines and secretive power plays. The legacy of Kerren's tenure, once marked by fear and suppression, had transformed into a cautionary tale retold at neighborhood gatherings. It served as a reminder that even the most entrenched abuses of power could be dismantled when a community stood together in pursuit of justice. In hushed tones over coffee and during spirited conversations at the local diner, residents recalled the moments of indignation and triumph, each story adding to the tapestry of their collective memory. One particularly memorable evening, as a gentle breeze rustled through the newly planted trees, a jovial neighbor approached Ethan with a playful glint in their eye. In hand, they held a mock HOA violation notice, an inside joke now repurposed as a symbol of their victory over the past. With a wry smile, Ethan accepted the faux citation and, with a dramatic flourish, pinned it to a community board. "They really tried," he quipped, eliciting laughter from those gathered. It was a moment of poetic justice, a mic drop that punctuated the long journey from oppression to empowerment. As the night deepened, the neighborhood's renewed energy lit up the darkened streets like stars scattered across a clear sky. The echoes of past battles were slowly replaced by the steady cadence of a community rebuilding itself on principles of respect and accountability. And though challenges would undoubtedly arise in the days ahead, the residents now knew that they held the power to shape their own destiny, united, vigilant, and ever ready to speak up when fairness was threatened. In that serene twilight, as Ethan leaned back in his chair and surveyed the scene before him, a quiet satisfaction took root. The community had not only reclaimed their rights, but had also redefined the true meaning of home, a place where every voice mattered and every act of unity was a victory over the forces of entitlement and division.